both indicated that the lore across several different tribes was that the giants depicted in the petroglyphs were red-headed cannibal giants.
Yeah.
We live in little worlds, predictable worlds. What you see is what you get. 8-ball in the corner pocket if you just hit it right. Rack 'em up and do it again. Just matter in motion, angles, and energy. Mechanical cause and effect, nothing to see here, folks.
But some of us are discovering that in some times and places, usually at the borders and on the margins, a strange underworld peeks through, challenging our settled notions of a sterile, explored, mechanistic world. Lights in the forest, lights in the sky, voices in the dark, a knock at the door, shapes in the trees.
My name is Ward. I make adventure films about high strangeness.
And I'm Jim. I make teenagers talk to me about dead people. Come along as we explore and reflect on bizarre experiences, our enchanted world, and mythic history. This is the Ohio Howl. Mythology and archaeology are strange bedfellows, the former being tied to cultural imagination, while the latter attests to the here and now, real facts. It seems, however, the two are more intimately wed than we think. Sitting down now in my all-weather room, the sun bearing in as the winter snows of Ohio refract it in so many scintillating colors, the squirrels race here and there to navigate to their next meal. We consider the actual history of thousands of years as a giant problem, and literally so, because there is a burden of evidence that suggests giants have shacked up in the Ohio Valley and west for millennia. Perhaps this is a simple tale, mere folklore, told by others in more rigorous scholarly conversations. Perhaps this is a Smithsonian coup of information, best left undisclosed and tightly sealed in their many basement archives. Or perhaps it is a through line by which we navigate together the multifaceted history of the Western Hemisphere, where kings and scions fled from covenantal conflict to mine tin, smith weapons, and venerate their dark fathers, finally kicking up their feet to enjoy the sunset over the Great Lakes.
Checkity check. Awesome. We're recording. I'll sample that later. For our noise core band.
Yeah.
It's going to be called Aural Havoc.
Aural Havoc.
Yeah, okay. So we're wanted to talk about giants in ancient America. And I feel like this has been talked about by so many people better qualified than me. But I'm interested what you have turned up.
Mm-hmm.
And I found some articles and stuff, but I'm really interested to hear your take on this.
Well, I think it's important for two reasons. One is that it continues to substantiate that there is a supernaturalism that infuses real history. It's not just this esoteric extra category. It's a lived experience. And it's one which, especially where we're sitting right now, has a great significance geographically. And I would say, two, it really helps to bridge the gap between why is America so haunted? I think actually has a great deal to explain that sort of interaction going on. Like, why is the high strangeness epicenter of the world Appalachia, the Ohio Valley? Why are there other pinpoints in America that have known traffic with people that no one liked and that ate them and kept eating them, and then until they were finally smoked out and killed? Why is it that is where so much of this stuff is lodged? So I agree. I think there are great treatments on this subject that are worth everyone's attention and are probably better than we could do. But what I wanted to focus on was why I think it's important to cover and help to, one of my goals is always to understand that myth is more true than false, and especially primeval history, prehistory, places around the world where we don't have a lot of written records, or if they exist, it's looking backwards after 1,000 years plus of oral history. What is valid there? What is true? And it's probably more on the whole than just fable. So I think that's why it's important to talk about this even briefly, because we've kind of skirted around it a few times. We talked last time about Chaco Canyon and the Lovelock Cave and kind of the Four Corners area of the United States, where there were a lot of accounts of, occult cannibalistic giants with red hair, and everyone hated them and they wanted them to die, and they eventually killed them off, but it was at great cost. But really, the great majority of the sites that we would attribute to this sort of incursion or immigration to the continent is either in the Amazon rainforest or in southern Ohio, which is 3 hours from where we're sitting right here. Where you showed me earlier, just even briefly, a map of megalithic sites in America, and it was like Ohio was red giant epicenter. There were 140 plus sites there. Most of their states had 3 or 4. There's something going on in our own backyard in the sense, and then, so there's some significance that's worth sussing out there.
Yeah, to your point on the myth, from that website, I had found in Pennsylvania a petroglyph that I had not been familiar with, and I was blown away by the number of sites like this that were on that map. But to your point about the myth being more true than fable, it requires a degree of intention and desire, which probably indicates importance to pass on an oral tradition, to pass on a myth, to encapsulate some body of knowledge into, a myth or fable. You have to want to pass that on. It has to be seen as important, probably. Where just, a whole cloth invention, just a story that we made up, I wouldn't think would bear that weight.
Reminds me of the textual critical statement on the account of the apostles with the death and resurrection of Christ. They have everything to lose by making it up.
Yeah, and then went and lost it.
Why would they do that?
Yeah.
There's a certain ground of evidence of just even common sense of, gut survivability.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think has been interesting about, quote, megalithic sites all over the world, that they take so much effort. And in many ways, effort that we can't even understand. We don't know how you don't just build Stonehenge. We still don't really know how it was done. We can guesstimate, but we have no written record, no historical record. It's just kind of lore, folklore. And particularly so many of the arguments that I see that I think are generally attempting to dismiss the why is, X number of hunter-gatherers in a random plain who are barely surviving decided to take a break for 16 months and erect, astronomically perfectly aligned megaliths, and then went back to picking berries. That doesn't seem to hold a lot of water. And that's a big thing, especially because in the American conversation, it's the mounds. The mounds and the petroglyphs. Those are the two great categories of what is this? We don't understand.
So backing up for a second, what's the 30,000 foot view hypothesis of where the giants come from? And I'm sure that the audience is familiar with Genesis 6, Nephilim, all this, but in terms of geography and history, what do we think roughly happened to bring giants to America?
As far as I can understand, I think the most airtight, concrete, and consistent record is that it is the heritage of the Amorite people from Canaan, who were known as a giant tribe in the Old Testament. They were known as a giant tribe from all their neighbors. The Amorites showed up. They were pre-2000 BC, but then they eventually basically became the late Sumerian, and the original Babylonian people. The Babylon was built by the Amorites. Hammurabi was an Amorite. So Hammurabi's code, the whole legal system, this great ordering of society, this is a massive civic leap forward. It comes from an Amorite king who basically set up shop in Babylon. And as Babylon wanes over time, and then they come back. I mean, there are multiple dynasties here, but the original thrust of old Babylon was the Amorite people. And they end up colonizing all over the Levant, Canaan, and the upper reaches of like what is today Syria, Lebanon, that area. And then they're driven out in great mass by, you know, we have at the very least a lot of tension with their neighbors, but then we kind of have the hammer blow as Joshua comes in the conquest of Canaan, and that's, you know, before Judges, that's like 1400 BC or so. Old enough that they got out of Dodge, those who weren't routed, because not everybody was. A lot of them left, and a lot of them also captured, held, or influenced the early Phoenician city-states. So again, there's a connection of they have great relations with shipbuilders and navigators, and they pieced out.
Do we have, so to that point, do we have extra biblical evidence for the conquest of Canaan?
There is, yes. We have records from both like late, or actually, one of the best places we can look are the Hittites, because they were really, we think of them more as like where Turkey is today. They would have been in traditionally Anatolia, would the name before as Asia Minor, Anatolia, Asia Minor, Turkey eventually. And they were obsessed with recording everything about their neighbors. In fact, they were probably like the most superstitious people because they basically venerated every god possible, just the off chance that that's the right one to venerate. And so they were great chroniclers. And there's a lot about the diaspora of many peoples from Palestine, Canaan, that area that we know today, up into their territory because they're living in Anatolia. They're in Asia Minor. And this becomes the superhighway from the Middle East to Europe.
So do those refugees eventually become the Gauls?
Yes.
Okay.
That's actually a good segue, because that's one of the most interesting points here. So think of like Galatia, right? We have Paul's letter to the Galatians. We think of it as a church. It's actually a huge part of Asia Minor, right?
Yeah.
Big swath here. And the Gauls are this foreign migratory people who come in and just kind of eat up all the land and build all the things and then ditch that and keep going west. To the Gauls, like we have the Scythians, we have those coming out of what is now like the Rhineland in Germany. All this ethnicity keeps following that way.
Are there any records of these people as their refugees or whatever being large, being giants?
Yes, very much so. So it's interesting because pardon me, the word Gaul is thought by many to come from basically the word powerful. Like it's a base word for you're a big deal. The Gauls, which is what's linked to Galatia. So like Galatia is the very old form Galatian. It then becomes kind of early Latinized, well, not even Latinized, but early Europeanized as Gaul in the parochial. So like the Romans, who at this point in time, let's say it's still BC, like Roman Kingdom, we're not at the empire yet, but their northern border is against all the Gauls. And they're consistently talking about how these people are indomitable. There's a Roman historian, Julius Florus, 2nd century AD, describes one figure, Teutobochus, a blue-eyed, red-haired Gaul king, as a man of extraordinary stature who used to vault over 4 or 6 horses at once. When captured, he was seen above all trophies or spoils of the enemies. The Greek historian Polybius, this is 200-ish BC, laments that thanks to the Celts, the Gauls became the Celts, and I'll explain that shortly. Because of the Celts, the Roman legionaries had become superior fighting machines. Quote, once they had got used to being struck down by Gauls, they were incapable of imagining anything worse. It reminds me, what was that old Dennis Quaid movie, Major League, I think, where he's like a rec league baseball coach, but he can throw like a 102 mile per hour fastball. So his team, of like 8th graders can't keep up until they finally do, and now they become an unstoppable force because they're used to being pitched at by a 100-mile fastball. And then, you've got like Timmy over here throwing the 40 softball. They just blast it. So that's interesting. Polybius talks about that. And there are many stories and legends of kind of these giant Gauls or Celts in the mythologies all throughout Europe. So yeah, the Celt is basically just again, kind of a transliteration of Gaul across language barriers.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. So the Celt, like we think of the Celts as the British and the Irish, Celtic or Gaelic, that idea. And that's not incorrect, but they didn't start there. They were a migratory people, and everybody in the area knew that for hundreds of years. They were trucking on through Europe. So there are a lot of accounts of men and women of tremendous stature. In fact, I think it's correct to say the word Germani, where we get German, is like kind of a proto-Latinized idea of genuine. The idea of like, you're a real Celt. The Germanic people were like, you don't mess with them. They're the real deal. So Proto-Latin for OG. Original giant, let's say that.
What what time period are we talking about here?
This would be probably like, I think the earliest accounts that I've come across are around 1000 to 800 BC.
Okay.
And then, so again, this is like the kingdom of Rome, the kind of Mycenaean period of Greece. So it's before the city-states, it's before the kingdoms, it's before the empire, it's early landscape, Mediterranean Europe.
Would this be the same? So I know we read, was it Gilbert who?
Derek Gilbert?
Yeah, who put the Greek pantheon being inherited from Mesopotamian.
Right.
Would this be the same migratory movement that maybe brings that?
I think it would be, if not the same, it's adjacent. It makes the time fits because again, his argument, and a lot of archaeology backs this up in watching, especially the transmigratory patterns across Asia Minor. Again, Turkey, as we see it today, was like the bridge between East and West. So everything that was moving was going through there. And it really is like as of the century before and after the conquest of Canaan by Israel is the time when all these migrations kick off. And rightly so, because if you got 3 million angry Jews with swords trying to reclaim their promised land, whether or not that's valid, those people, if they're not killed, are like, peace out. See ya. And so you either are getting on ships and going down the Red Sea or across the Mediterranean Sea, or you're migrating north, because there was a lot of friction in Egypt at that time too, because Egypt had a pretty high dynastic power. So it's kind of a barrier. Like people weren't fleeing to Egypt because Egypt just kicked them out or killed them. So you're going either by sea, west or south, or by land, north and then west across Anatolia.
Okay, so we have this people group moving westward through Europe, arriving in, the Celtic lands. What time are we roughly looking at for like Stonehenge?
Stonehenge is dated in many places. The tough thing with Stonehenge and a lot of sites like it is because they're made of stone, and you can't really carbon date stone.
Yeah.
Right. And I have a lot of faith in carbon dating. I think it's been a refined technique, but it does require organic material. And what makes that very tricky is if you have a stone site, you have to find organic material that somehow correlates to the stone. And a lot of times that's errant because it's like, oh, we found the remains of a cook fire 800 years after it was built. Well, I guess it's that date. Things like that. So I wish we could date the stone, but we can't date the stone. Yeah. The difference, though, is that we have the ability, and I think this has become more vogue lately, is the idea of so many of these sites, and this is an important point for this whole conversation anyway, is astronomically aligned. Like Stonehenge, when Stonehenge was first really dug up and excavated, the prevailing idea was, isn't it such an interesting coincidence that all of the gateways and lintels and lines and stones line up with the constellations from a little while ago? And they're like, haha, they're dumb, stupid Celtic hunter-gatherers, again, who somehow decided to build this monolithic site. Good for them, they got it right on accident. Never was there a consideration like they knew what they were doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you start to date megalithic sites like this with kind of archaeoastronomy, and you realize it's almost perfect, it's better than we could do. I don't even own a telescope. I don't know. I
Yeah.
can't see the night sky most nights because of light pollution. These people had a mastery of the night sky. And that was kind of like the great cosmic wheel that they looked at that ordered everything in their lives. And I think there's even something to say, go back to like Babylonian mathematics, which is what these Amorites would have been a part of. They knew this stuff better than anybody. So I think the prevailing date from an archaeoastronomical point, which is a mouthful, is somewhere between like 3000 and 1500 BC for Stonehenge, which is a big deal. And I think, again, if you look at Amorite people, both who were fleeing as of the conquest of Canaan and also were shipbuilders and explorers well before then, it would not surprise me that there were many generations of this people group or their adjacents stacking up in the British Isles and northern France and kind of the North Sea area all the way up to that point.
This could be totally aside from that point, but I recently was listening. I can't remember who it was. It was a jumping off point from Jim Jordan's Revelation series, talking about um, the astrological significance in the ancient world, which is significantly different than astrology, horoscope stuff today.
Sure, like the actual practice of like really paying attention to stuff.
And I thought, I mean, I'm sure that this is interesting, and I wondered about it, and I wanted to ask you. This might not even make it in the podcast, but I wanted to ask you about this just as because I was interested. So Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. And apparently that's whose voice is not heard is like a difficult translation challenge. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent or a tabernacle for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. Then there's like a transition. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, and on. A sort of special revelation, right? So it seems like the first 6 verses are about the heavens declaring a certain kind of speech, a certain kind of knowledge. And then the contrast with the law of the Lord, like what you have, is perfect, is complete. So Jordan's take on this is that, in the Old Testament, and this connects to the Stonehenge point, but in the Old Testament, you see there are Israelites and Gentiles. There are faithful Israelites and unfaithful Israelites. There are God-fearing Gentiles and pagan Gentiles, in the sense of like not God-fearing Gentiles.
Right.
So Melchizedek is, not a Jew. Uriah, not a Jew. Right. So his point and his contention with that, and then in Romans 1, where it references, I think, Psalm 19, is that the tabernacle for the sun is actually, like, that's why the ancients picked the constellations they did. It wasn't because the constellation jumps out at you as like, oh, Virgo is obviously a woman. Like, that's, you could make it anything you want. It's just random. But they're the band that the sun travels.
Right, exactly.
And so like they're the ones to pay attention to. This is the house of the sun, the tabernacle of the sun. And so, sort of in the Old Testament pre-Christ, in the Old Testament pre-Christ, you could have God-fearing Gentiles that are reacting to the revelation they have, which is natural revelation. And he disagrees with, I think, the Reformed take is, or the one that I've heard before is that there's enough revelation in nature to condemn everybody, but not enough to lead anyone to be an actual God-fearer. Because if they were, they would join the nation of Israel. He disagrees with that and says, similarly, like the God-fearing Gentiles had enough to actually be God-fearing based on the story in the stars, or whatever the speech and the knowledge that's being talked about in Psalm 19.
Yeah.
However, for us to go back and try to investigate and find out exactly how that works, what's being told in the stars, is in a technical sense, not a pejorative sense, although maybe, but in a technical sense, retarded. It's going backwards.
Yeah.
Because in Psalm 19, the progression is, but the law of the Lord is perfect. So the Gentiles, the God-fearing Gentiles, have this astrological information that in some sense allows them to be God-fearing Gentiles without connection to the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant people.
They got enough that it counts.
Yeah. But there's no sense in going back and investigating that because what we have is so much fuller.
Yep. A great analogy I have heard many times, and I still stand by it, is looking at like an old covenant revelation of, quote, the gospel before it had that name even. If you go up a ski lift, it's very snowy right here right now, so it's pertinent to talk about this. If you go up a ski lift to the top of a hill and go ski down it, you could be on a bench or you could be in like an enclosed gondola. I've been in both, having skied for many years. The gondola is like you're enclosed. You're in basically like a capsule with a little window in the front, and it's more comfortable because the wind is not hitting you in the face for the 15 minutes it takes to go up the hill. You can see the top of the window, but you have no vantage point for anything around you. Or you could be on an open air bench. You're going to the exact same place, but now you see everything around you if you care to lean your head back and forth. The idea of kind of the succession of revelation, Old Covenant, New Covenant, that I think is a useful analogy. I still stand by it. And that's similar there. I think that as much as I agree that without true special revelation, you cannot really know who Christ is, yet one glaring example from Scripture itself of general revelation in this astrological sense being unbelievably impactful, the three magi who show up at the birth of Christ. I saw a great meme a long time ago where it's like girls with astrology, it's like, that dude's a Leo and I can't stand him. And it's like, yes, queen. And then it's boys with astrology and it's like the three kings and they're like, we've seen the rising star of the new God. We must go find him. But that's what it's described in Scripture.
Yeah.
So, and you think about like, on the tradition of the church suggests that the Magi came out of Babylon. And if you go back, 600 years, you've got Daniel in Babylon. And he is the great picture of the faithful Jew who still wants to pursue the welfare of his pagan nation because he's a citizen, up to the point where he's told to worship somebody else. But he's trying to promote that. And he's mentioned in his own narrative that he is an astrologer. He's a man of the stars. He's a man of alchemical science. Like, I think it's easy for us to knee-jerk against these things and say they're horrible. They're totally wrong. They're pagan nonsense. Like, well, you can certainly apply it that way. But there is a certain point per Psalm 19 where actually looking at the heavens, not just looking up and like, oh, look, I see stars. That's cool. No, it's like the ancient world understood this precession of the equinox, this astronomical phenomenon that they were willing to trace back like hundreds of thousands of years if they do the math. And so we see the Magi coming out of Babylon with Daniel's influence being a righteous astrologer, so to speak, not divining fate from the stars, but seeing like this is the tapestry that God has erected. So these guys see the star in Bethlehem and they're like, something is up.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've been paying attention to these charts for hundreds of years, and this is an anomaly. And that leads them literally to go and give gifts to the incarnate Christ.
Yeah.
I'm hard-pressed to say that's not general revelation that leads to special revelation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right. And if there's enough there to survive, 470 plus years from Daniel to, like, if there's enough to be looking for a coming king, which is what they say.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe that's, yeah. So the connection then with like Stonehenge and all of these effigy mounds and things that we're going to talk about is some of them are pretty explicit in which direction the significance is leaning. Like the serpent mound is a serpent swallowing an egg or a seed.
Yeah, it's pretty on the nose.
Also the sun, right?
Or on the mouth as well.
Yeah. But some of them I wonder about, you could interpret like a significance being given to the sun in a site. You could interpret that as sun worship in a pagan divorced sense. But you could also, if Psalm 19 is correct, you can see why they would, a God-fearing Gentile, a God-fearing pagan might have a similar reverence for or a similar significance to the path of the sun and all of that, given what it meant, to the Magi. So anyway, I just thought it was an interesting aside.
I don't think it's even an aside. I think it's very relevant because so I would say the two ways to think about how do we end up with giants in America is look at the archaeology from the Middle East to America, and you're going to find two common patterns. One are these astronomically perfect megaliths all over the place. They're all over Europe, they're all over England, they're all over Iceland, and they're all over America. There's got to be a common thread there. That's one point. The second is also the technology that's left behind in terms of remnants. And that is, so if we go all the way back thinking about the Amorites, who I will say, it could be more than the Amorites, but I think that's a nice sphere to align this conversation. Amorites ended up representing, they took over the end of the Sumerian kingdom and they founded the original Babylonian kingdom. And this was the epicenter of probably the greatest military technology of the Bronze Age. They were the tops. We take it for granted, for instance, like I can go to my shed over there and pull out a hoe to pull up some dirt, and it's got a metal socket with a wood handle. That's a lot sturdier than if it was just a piece of brittle metal or a hand-carved piece of wood. One of the huge advancements in Sumerian military technology was literally the socket. It sounds unimpressive today when we could like nuke Russia at a press of a button. But it was tremendous because, 1-to-1, you lose if you're against a socketed weapon because it's going to last so much longer. There's so much more durability. I mean, they were riveting their weapons together. They were tapering. They were adding an elongated middle center to their spear tips so that it was stronger and lasted longer. These, again, seem inconsequential today when you can drive a tank or shoot an AR-15. But in 2100 BC, you win every time because you have this. No one else did. That's why the Amorites took over Sumer and Babylon and founded city-states everywhere because they killed everybody. They were good at it. And if we're going to also suppose they were probably 8 to 9 feet tall, they just had a pretty significant advantage. When you think about Goliath and his brothers and like Og of Bashan, they have, what is it? The description in the scriptures is like their spear was the haft of a weaver's beam, like this just massive weapon. And if it's already advanced technologically and you're huge and it's huge, you lose when you go up against it. Obviously, unless you're David, because you're a good shot. But the difference is that we see all throughout Europe these weapon tips, and they had no commerce with the local populations. Like when the Gauls and the Celts came through, those are the sites where we find the tanged spearheads and the riveted socket tips. The wood obviously rots away, but those metal tips are there. And there was no adjacent analog in the peoples who lived there for hundreds of years to create this. Like, it was very metallurgically sophisticated.
Mm.
And that is something the Amorites were known for. They were master smiths. They were astronomers. They were mathematicians. They were scientists. Like, they had better insight into this stuff. And then you go word from there into England, like around Cornwall and Stiltshire and places like around Stonehenge, frankly. They're exhausted tin and copper mines that are totally dug out. Like, there's nothing left. And what do you find archaeologically in those areas? A bunch of these weapon heads. And then they're in Iceland. They're even in Greenland. And then they're all over Canada. And then they're all over the Great Lakes region. That's kind of the payout for this conversation, is you can trace both megalithic structures that are astronomically aligned and these weapon remains that were very advanced no matter where they showed up at the time. They're everywhere. There's copper mined out all over Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio. Like, hundreds of thousands of tons of copper has been mined out. And these are Neolithic sites, as we would describe them today. They are prehistoric, so to speak. And the native peoples, the indigenous populations, are like, yeah, we didn't mine that. Nor do we know how to build a lunar crescent moon-shaped axe, which are found also in remains all over these sites. Like, these are Mesopotamian weapons.
Yeah.
And they're in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Well, Delavan Lake was one of the things that I saw came up in Wisconsin, where they found, it's difficult because, and we can talk about, everyone who's familiar with this Giants in America thing is probably familiar with the idea that the Smithsonian takes the skeletons and possibly dumps them in the ocean or absconds with them somehow and covers it all up.
Yeah.
So we don't have remains. We just have all of these reports and news stories and that kind of thing from the last 150 years.
Which, interject real quick.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone can look up giant newspaper stories, 1800s, on Google. And so many of those are digitized. I mean, you could probably read 1,000 newspaper articles in one search, and it's worth doing. I haven't read all of them, but it's like the information is still broadly available to see. This was so consistently recorded in early Americana archaeology. It's not a spoof. It's not a hoax. Like, the body of evidence is way too big to just simply dismiss it.
Yeah.
Even though that's, like, as you said, the Smithsonian was like, yoink, we'll just take those and get rid of them.
Yeah. And the idea, the commonly rationale given for it is like someone mistook a mammoth bone for a thigh bone, which, okay, on occasion, but a lot of these stories are giant skulls, 2 rows of teeth, elongated heads. Like,
Right.
It's not...
Not to mention there are like 70,000 sites in America that have been dug up with this stuff. So it's just the sheer volume of example is just absurd to dismiss as, whoops, everybody thought it was a mammoth bone.
Yeah. Well,
it was a really big gopher from the Ice Age. Like, no.
It trades on the sort of chronological arrogance of...
absolutely.
These idiots were finding.
Which is probably... I mean, and not even to be pejorative, but that was very... I would not be surprised if that was the motivation of, for instance, the Smithsonian saying, we're going to go and erase any evidence that we are not dominant today. I mean, I'm glad... I'll go on the record. I'm glad all the giants are dead in America. Glad they're not here anymore.
Yeah.
Because that's bad news for everyone they interact with. As the indigenous First Nation has abundantly made clear, they were horrible enemies. But I'm not at risk of being demoted because there was a giant who lived in the Ohio Valley. Right? I mean, frankly, spiritually speaking, like, they're not image bearers.
Yeah.
And that's an ontological shock, frankly, like that there was someone here who was an aberration in the pattern.
Yeah.
And it's not for no reason that everybody who lived here was like, we need to kill those guys.
Yeah.
Just like Joshua did.
Yeah, that image bearing thing is really interesting when and I don't know if you were to take the opposite, there are no actual giants take, um you could accuse our position when it comes to the Canaanite genocide,
Sure. Quote unquote.
yeah, of just sort of ad hoc having this rationale that suddenly removes the apparent moral qualms in the Canaanite genocide, Joshua killing everything, man, woman, child, beast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if we're correct, if they really are these, human fallen angel hybrid things um, that don't bear the image, it does make a lot more sense of that total destruction that's waged on the Canaanites.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be waged on those people as they trek across the globe in the
They were
centuries
everyone's
after.
enemies.
Yeah.
Everyone's enemies.
And it also is an interesting point about what it means to bear the image of God. And, Heiser, the late Dr. Michael Heiser, thought that the image had more to do with serving an office, that it had to do with sort of the vice regent office that man is
the
given
dominion category. Yeah.
to have dominion. And so in that sense, obviously these are, these are the rebels version of what they want to have dominion.
Right. You're
Not-
usurpers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So we've got them to Celtic lands from Canaan through Anatolia, Asia Minor, Europe. We've got megalithic sites, correct, in all of these locations, sort of progressing this
Yep.
way. How do we get them across the ocean?
So I think two things. One, as one slight backup, is interesting that when you look, are you familiar with the triads of the Welsh? This is a great
No.
mythical history that the folks from Wales kept, and it's kind of the anchor point for most of the British, Irish, Welsh, Pictish, everything up in those islands, mythology and lore. The first triad, I'll read it here. These are translated and collected in the early 1800s, but this is like the oral history of Wales. It says there were 3 names given to the Isle of Britain from the first. Before it was inhabited, it was called the Seagirt Green Space. Clas Murden is the Welsh. After it was inhabited, it was called the Honey Island. And after the people formed into a commonwealth by Prydain, it was denominated the Isle of Britain. But those first 2 are interesting. Clas Murden is this ancient Welsh, and it can be translated in 2 ways that I've found. One, the enclosure of Merlin, which is also just wild and probably outside the scope of this conversation, but like obviously very mythical. Or it can be understood to be known as the digging of the Mers or the digging of the Amorites. That's from the Welsh. So like the very first name, before Albion, which comes actually out of like Renaissance literature, that's supposedly the first name, but it's not. The original name is Clas Murden, is the name of the British Isles. And it could be translated possibly as the digging of the Amorites, like just on the nose. This is where the Amorites showed up and mined the whole island, made their weapons, and then got out of here. That's one thing I'll say. Also, again, that could also be translated as Merlin's enclosure. So it's like every weird magical thing about Arthurian legend could also be connected to the Amorites and their expedition to the British Isles. But I think we mentioned it at the beginning. We were talking about the Phoenicians. And the Phoenician, it wasn't really an empire, but they were almost like a syndicate. I think that's the best way to describe the Phoenicians. They were like a cartel.
Mm.
They just brokered everything. They weren't really the top dogs at any one point, but they had the money and the resources coming in and going out for basically everybody involved. They started in Tyre and Sidon, the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, but they eventually founded Carthage as a huge colony, and then we have the whole Punic Wars thing, and we got Hannibal riding elephants over the Alps. Like, it's a wild story. But the Phoenicians were easily the most expert navigators and mariners of the ancient world. Like, there's no contest there. They were the best. They had the best ships, they had the best navigators. To that earlier astrological and astronomical conversation, they understood with mastery the night sky. Like, they were never lost. And that's where you could go off on a tangent and like they went around the Horn of Africa and crash landed in Brazil, and there are Phoenician manuscripts and tablets in Amazonia. But I think we also have to appreciate that their locality was deeply adjacent to everything the Amorites did. Like, ultimately, we end up with like Goliath of Gath of Philistia, right? He was a giant. He was recruited by the Philistines, and the Philistines were a shoreline civilization on the Mediterranean, and they inherited all the shipping lanes of the Phoenicians. And then we have other examples, even in North America, where there are Philistine and Hittite writings on rocks, pictures of ships and galleys that come from like the ancient world, and somehow they're in like New England.
Yeah, to that point,
Yeah.
I mean, this article, it's a scholarly article called Phoenician Coins and Phoenician Exploration by Dr. Mark A. McMenamin. The abstract of it, I read to you before we started recording, but
Yeah.
it's pretty interesting. Numismatic evidence favoring the hypothesis of a Carthaginian presence in North America has recently come to light.
Totally.
The evidence is twofold. The first piece of evidence consists of a particular group of early Carthaginian gold coins, called staters, that bear a map, derived from modified Punic letters, showing both the Old World and the New World. The second piece of evidence consists of a series of 7 or 8 copper coins found scattered across North America from Nebraska to Georgia to Connecticut. The coins have an image of the Punic horse, the Phoenician palm tree, uprooted as if to be transplanted, and an enigmatic inscription in the Punic language. It seems unlikely that these coins were brought across the Atlantic in modern times, and if authentic, they suggest a Carthaginian presence in ancient America. Taken separately, these pieces of evidence could be dismissed as some type of fluke or hoax, respectively. But taken together, along with the fact that Carthaginian gold and base metal coins were reported from the Azores in 1778, the available evidence suggests that the Carthaginians had the ability to cross the Atlantic at will.
I'm not surprised. Again, we tend to look back, as Lewis says, with chronological snobbery on our past. Clearly, they couldn't do any of these things because we now can do them. So we're better than them, and they then can't do the things we can do. I do not recall the name of the gentleman, but he had found some Egyptian manuscript where it was basically building a boat out of reeds and rushes and had a transatlantic voyage. People thought he was insane and that this story was ridiculous, and then he basically reverse engineered it, built it, and then sailed from Egypt to all the way through the Mediterranean, past the Strait of Gibraltar. I think he landed in Haiti or the Dominican Republic, but he did it. And that's, talking dynastic Egypt, that's a long time ago. Not to mention that it almost became like rote that the Norse did transatlantic voyages over and over and over again. Like, by the time Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, it's like, dude, this is old hat. We know how to do this. Let alone going back into this more kind of primeval era, and not even, like, just a few thousand years BC, we have written records of a lot of voyages over here. There's the Windover site in Florida. It's like by Cape Canaveral, pretty close to where like SpaceX is shooting off all their rockets all the time. There's a guy who is just regrading his backyard with a backhoe and pulls up a scoop of like 5 skulls and a torso. Like, ooh, let's go ahead and stop that. This site was dated in Florida, east coast of Florida, on the Atlantic side,
to probably 9 to 8,000 BC,
Mm.
like super old. Now, most theories would say we're not surprised there are people in America 9 to 8,000 BC. The difference is that genetic testing showed none of them were indigenous populations. They were all Indo-European by DNA. And like incontrovertible, these are people who somehow were in Florida in 9,000 BC who were from the Fertile Crescent or the Anatolia or somewhere in the Middle East, in the Proto-Indo-European idea. So I think it kind of behooves us to try and take off blinders that say this is impossible, this can't happen. I mean, I'm a pretty soft 21st century man. Like, I'm sure I am not as hardy as people who could get in a boat and just like survive until they don't die.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking too, especially because you look at South America, where a lot of these reports come as well from several thousand years BC, like pre-Maya, pre-Inca, and there are clans of people who live and their king is this giant. And that's said over and over again. Magellan, de Casas, Pizarro, all these Portuguese and Spanish explorers came over and they would confirm that for hundreds of years, the people they would meet in South America, their king was always a giant. He was like 9 feet tall. There probably weren't a lot of them. I don't think it's to the point where there's a whole nation of giants living in America, north or south. But there was enough of a bloodline that I think there was a kind of lineage of dominance and primacy. And that's what keeps living on in these myths and these retellings. And again, it's like there's a great map. I forget the author is Harmonius, I think, was a Dutch map maker who tried to encapsulate all the records that he heard from the initial Portuguese voyages to South America. And they were always like, everybody in this area are huge. That's why Patagonia is named Patagonia. It's a kind of a slang from both Portuguese and Spanish that means like the place of the big-feeted people.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're in a caravel off the coast of Argentina and there's a 10-foot giant like dancing in some tribal ritual on the shore, and they send a little guy on a skiff and they're like, go shake hands with that guy.
Yeah.
And he's like comes up to his waist.
I think 2 points that are really kind of interesting. So even as the numbers of these people dwindle in this continent, they're given a certain cultic significance. Right?
Mhm.
They're given, the rulers. They're, I think another interesting thing that I found just googling around is there's a rock with a bunch of petroglyphs inscribed on it in Pennsylvania, relatively close to us, that I had never heard of, called Indian God Rock.
Yep.
And one of there are petroglyphs on this rock. You can Google it and see it's on sandstone. But one of the interesting things that when it's discovered by a French expedition in the 1700s, they note that the Native American guides that they're with, quote, regarded the rock with superstitious reverence. So there's some, they treat these, and I think some of these inscriptions are, of not Native American language. And so, but it's interesting that these, there's a cultural and, the root of culture, cultic, religious significance given to these giants, it seems like, in lots of locations here. And even, I mean, as they travel across, the Graham Hancock talks about all of these different cultures that have their cultural heroes surviving the deluge, and giving unique cultural gifts to the people, technology and wisdom and knowledge that survives with them, which is an interesting angle if we were just talking about cases of gigantism. um, why would there be this outsized cultic significance to the culture and the knowledge that these things bring with them? Because just a huge, like an abnormally large member of the population might be cause for, benighted um, pagan people to be like, oh, praise the gods, we've been blessed with this giant, this very tall person. But if you look at cases of gigantism, it's not like they're necessarily shockingly athletically superior,
Right.
just by virtue of being, elongated skeleton.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's no reason for that weight of cultic significance to be put on these people.
Yeah, an ironic parallel to that is that, as I've read, especially a lot of lore from both the Inca and the Maya, they venerated kind of physically deformed folks in their population, as opposed to, as ironically, in the Near East, those were always ostracized and shut out and pushed away from society. In Mesoamerica and northern South America, those folks who were not tremendous and powerful, they were actually the opposite. They were said, those are the ones who were touched by the gods and were kind of like held at a high position. They were usually the scribes and the sages. But again, we have the parallel there where in Mesoamerica and South America, especially, I would include Florida there because we seem to have so much contact from Europeans with the indigenous peoples in Florida right off the bat before everybody died of smallpox.
Whoops.
There is both this veneration of deformation, but also still the regency of like the big guy, literally, is still the person who's usually the king. Like even Atahualpa, when Cortez comes to the Mayan capital, Atahualpa was said to be like 7'3", 7'4", which by giant standards is actually not even that impressive at this point. But it's like, this is probably a long time as this bloodline has been dwindling.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about that, but it seems to fit the bill. By the time you're in the 1500s, and if you've been there, if Phoenician giants or Sidonian giants or whatever, Amorites have shown up in America 2,000 years before, and there are only so many of them, probably going to dwindle off to a certain point.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other can of worms of like, what are the genetics of giant lineage?
Yeah. And
at what point do you still get to become a demon when you die?
Yeah. There's a whole lot of a body of conspiracy theory about how, all of the ruling families in Europe and then subsequently the US are preserving their Nephilim bloodline.
Yes, they have like, the significant percentage in the, post-Habsburg dynasty.
Yeah. It's the reason they all wear funny hats.
Sometimes you just want to wear a funny hat.
Yeah, I do on occasion.
Well, so here's another question, and I think this is important. Like, so we're talking about how probably there's a validity of people getting here who are not like us. They come from a different extract. They come from a different background. They have, at least in their context, superior technology, which also fits the bill for kind of watcher knowledge and all that, being inherited through generations. They're the best of the best. Everyone hates them wherever they go, and also everyone dies wherever they go because they're way better at fighting because they're huge and they have better weapons. They end up in America. I think the more interesting question for me is why then, if we look at kind of the paranormal history of our country, which is wacky, and I think is probably more pronounced than most other places in the world, what is the connection between these folks who show up on our shores and build a bunch of mounds and astronomically and mathematically profound earthworks and then die? What is then the connection that we have, the Mothman showing up?
Yeah.
How do we get from Amorite giants in Ohio Valley to poltergeist and Bigfoot?
Yeah. Well, I think I've been thinking a lot about geography and what, is sort of in general, we've been talking about how the spirit realm, for lack of a better term, and
Mhm.
this material realm and the physical realm that we experience are not entirely separated
Right.
things. It's just a matter of how much of it can be seen by
Mhm.
and by whom. Um, the in the Day of Atonement ritual, the priest puts the sins of the people on the goat for Azazel and then sends it out to Azazel territory, out into the wilderness.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a precedent for geography also being tied to Azazel's obviously a spiritual being.
Mhm.
So being tied to, there are places that are associated with different spiritual beings. So if you have, and the other pillar of this case would be that what we come to know as demons in the New Testament, or unclean, bastardized spirits,
Mhm.
are the dead Nephilim, the dead offspring of this unholy union. Um, if you import them to a place and then you kill off a bunch of them, now you have demons in the place.
Yeah.
Um, so, and given the chronological proximity, like we're much closer in time to the passing of those giants here than they are, say, in the Middle East or in
Mhm.
Europe. Um, and so maybe there's an element of like dissipation over time as the gospel spreads through. Um, there's some sort of geographical actual tie
Yeah.
between the two things. So that's my sort of loose theory for why that is um and on top of that, when you instances of ancestor worship, I think Gilbert talks about this in the Saturn book. um Instances of ancestor worship are not like my grandma from 2 generations ago.
Right.
It's like it's way back up.
Yeah. The demiurge of my family from
Yeah,
eons past, who's in the frickin' netherworld.
right. And the Israelites, I think it's in Numbers when God's describing the Israelites taking on that ancestor worship practice, says they took demons for their gods.
Right.
So I think you're looking at the veneration of the Nephilim spirits, the veneration of the demonic, um, in those ancestor worship cult
Yep.
kind of things, which travels like is ubiquitous, like all through lots of different cultures.
Yeah. And that is an important point because it is everywhere. It's like, and so I had mentioned, okay, megaliths, you can track the construction of megaliths, astronomically aligned megaliths. That's also like the path of these people, their weaponry, but also that ancestor worship,
Mm.
especially when it just becomes kind of like a cult folklore that just nobody knows where it came from. We just do it. And that's all throughout Germany and France and Denmark. That's all, I mean, it's like the majority of Celtic lore in Ireland and England is all about that. You've got the Fomorian giants, you've got the Tuatha De Danann, you've got the fairies. And that's an interesting point, too, where, in England, fairies live in mounds.
Mm.
And then you look at like all throughout North America, especially in the Ohio Valley, it's mounds, it's earthworks. Because like the Great Lakes area, England doesn't have a lot of stone. There surely is stone, but not nearly. If you're in Peru, there's stone everywhere.
Yeah.
Everything's built out of stone. That's why even Stonehenge is so fascinating because it's in a place. It's like an open plain. There's no quarries anywhere. I mean, what was it? Not even a year ago, there was a discovery that the altarpiece was traveled like 700 miles from Scotland because that was the quarry where they could find the stone.
Hmm.
So for most of Celtic Britannic folklore, everything is an earthwork, it's a mound. And then you show up in the Ohio Valley, and likewise, we don't have a lot of stone quarries, so you build it out of earth. It's earthworks and mounds. The fairies there, if you actually talk to somebody who is well acquainted with British folklore, it's not Tinkerbell you meet in the woods. Like, you don't follow the will o' the wisp into the woods. It's horrifying to meet the Fae. The fairies are not good.
Mhm.
The fairies are very evil. And then yet we also see like the predominance of haunting episodes, paranormal episodes, high strangeness episodes all throughout Appalachia, Ohio Valley, and elsewhere in the United States. It's around these burial mounds. And that's something that I think is very fascinating, where it's not like you met, the ghost of the person who died 20 years ago. That's not who that is. I think it's something much more nefarious.
Mhm.
And I don't say that even with tinfoil on my head. I just think like there's a legitimate correlation between the burial mounds of giants and then the necessity to understand their spirits are hanging out. You look at a lot of these burial mounds too. And I mean, I grew up, I was homeschooled in Ohio. I went to so many of these burial mounds, and over and over again, it's like there were no burial goods with these skeletons.
Hmm.
Contrast that, say, with like Egyptian
Right.
interment ritual, where it's like, hey, you're dead. We're going to give you everything you need to go into the afterlife. Because it was a dude. Maybe he was deified in the knowledge of the culture, but he was a guy. He was a man. He's a person, a human. None of these burial mounds have burial goods.
Hmm.
And I wonder, perhaps, if it's because everyone knew they weren't going anywhere when they died. They were stuck. These are demonic spirits. These are unclean spirits. These are people who can't go to heaven or hell. They're just rooted where they're buried. So perhaps, if you're in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and you could spit in any direction to hit a burial mound, that's why that place is screwed up.
Hmm.
Because it's inundated with basically demonic power.
Yeah.
So, we talk about, okay, there are giants in the Ohio Valley. They were here. You can go back to Shawnee and Algonquin legend, Iroquois. They talk about, I can think of a few that are named, like Ishtipapa, Ea, these like titanic figures who were the enemy of all the people. And this, to our last conversation, like Lovelock Cave and Chaco Canyon, there was probably a lot of sketchy stuff that went on there, and they basically buried these people in a cave and burned them alive. That was the only way to kill them. Ea is a great example of that. I think that was in Kentucky, where they basically had to build a trench and lure the giant into the trench and then bury it alive. That was the only way to kill it. Ishtipapa is another one where it's also connected. I think we talked about previously Joseph Riverwind, the Puerto Rican lore keeper in chief, who's a Christian and is trying to reconcile these things. He talked about how the Star Brothers came down at certain equinoctial points in time, and that's where these giants came from. It's like, okay, that's just a retelling of the Genesis 6 narrative. Like, that checks out. And that they were bad news. That they had to quote big medicine, and that's why everybody was like, okay, whatever you say, because you're going to kill us if we go across you. That's where those unions were coming from. And that a lot of that activity was especially, no matter where you were tribally, the lore really was centered in the Ohio Valley, which obviously we're not trying to toot our own horn, because I don't think it's like a great signet of pride. Be like, we've got the most giant demons than anybody else right in our backyard. I mean, we do. But I'm not putting a badge on my chest with that on there. But probably one of the most profound places in Ohio that have to do with this mound building giant culture is Newark.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there when I was a kid. I would love to go back there again now that I've thought so much more about this. But that place is wild board because it's like geometric perfection. In a way that makes no sense whatsoever. Like, it may just look like mounds and ridges and earthworks, but if you were to view it from the sky, which is also its own curious consideration, it's like perfect octagons and circles and squares that are geometrically identical across area and circumference and radius and all this. And there's the Pythagorean theorem everywhere. Like,
and it points to other sites and stuff.
It points to other sites, and they're like hundreds of miles away, and it's a direct, perfect line to the epicenter of that. And also, all the solstices and equinoxes line up. I mean, it's like the longer you look at it, the more bewildering it is. And again, it might not be as impressive as like the Pyramid of Khufu, because it's not built out of 2,600,000 pounds of granite, but it's still unbelievably technically adept. And all of the native indigenous folks would say, like, we didn't build that. We didn't. That's what's the irony of Serpent Mound. It's like recorded as this great Hopewell and Shawnee site. They're like, well, we didn't build that. Again, we just showed up. In fact, we don't live there because it seems like it's haunted.
Yeah.
Like, we don't live anywhere near these mounds because they're bad news.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting points that, yeah, I think about this a lot. When we were out in Utah, Johnny, our sort of
He's a Paiute guy that you had, right?
he was half Ute and half Lakota,
Okay.
I believe. But he's sort of the native advisor consultant for Space Wolf Research,
Yeah,
where we were out
right,
there.
right.
And when we were talking about, we had asked him where the skinwalker phenomena came from, as far as he could tell from the lore. And it was, he said there were entities that were here when the Navajo and the Ute came. The entities were here, and they
So
taught.
they were ironically the indigenous ones.
Yeah,
at that point.
Yeah, and they taught the skinwalker medicine, the skinwalker magic, to the Navajo, who then implemented it in war. But we talk about, why the high strangeness surrounding these things, and I think that's a further point bolstering the idea that there's a geographical tie to the giants that are slain and the spirits that are trapped in around that land. That that comports with these people's experience, who lacked the modern scientific rationale to dismiss what they experienced. So
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it's like, on the one hand, I don't want to sound hokey. I like, oh, it's the dead giants that haunted the earth. But also it's like, kind of the body of evidence suggests that is the most common denominator in these situations. And again, when you think about, there is so much dark folklore in Europe. And like, one great stopover on this Gallic migration from the Levant up into Europe and into England, and then eventually points west, was like Romania and Transylvania, like that part of the Balkans, where every single thing is so dark and creepy and haunted. Like, that's where we get vampiric lore. If you stop to squint, it doesn't really not make sense. It's like, okay, yeah, there's a ton of giant activity here. They killed a bunch of them. It was bad news, and now that lingers. And I wonder if that is, again, I'm not trying to have like a panacea answer for like, this is why everything is haunted. But if we take demonic activity to be something that is kind of shackled to its place of death, then like, no wonder there are, quote, haunted places, right? Like, they can't get away, and it's going to keep happening. I think of, we've been loath not to mention Fritz Zimmerman at this point in this episode, because he's done so much work to try and investigate these mound sites and bring a lot of this kind of pop archaeology to the surface. And one thing that he pointed out that I thought was interesting is he had never had any kind of paranormal or high strangeness encounters in his life until he started digging around burial mounds in America. And now it follows him everywhere he goes. And I think he's got good categorization for it. I don't think he's as woo as some people might think. I think he's maybe a little more grounded. But he's like, I would be a fool not to connect the dots between these burial places I go to and this weird stuff that keeps happening, and the weird stuff that happens to other people who are living near these mounds.
Yeah.
So if we are saying in thesis form, if it is a giant, it's not a good guy. It's this sort of hybridized mess. When it dies, there's a sort of haunting spirit element to it because it's basically demonic. That's the most true form of a demon definition. So when you have, like I said earlier, 7,000 plus burial mounds in America, that's a bad rap for everybody who's living near those 7,000 burial mounds. And they go they go way west. I mean, all the way
Yeah.
up to like Pacific Northwest, down to the Southwest, down in Mexico. Like, it's not like it's just the Ohio Valley, but there happens to be a great concentration there. When we figure that if this is a society that is more or less gifted with preternatural knowledge and science and sophistication, and also are just evil, and they're toast, sadly, that's a stain, that's a desecration on the land.
Yeah. And there's always, not always, but frequently, like Johnny related this as well as, oh shoot, I can't remember the guy's name, but the guy who pointed us toward the Fremont cliff dwelling petroglyphs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, both indicated that the lore across several different tribes was that the giants depicted in the petroglyphs were red-headed cannibal giants.
Yeah.
Um, and that the human sacrifice, the eating, follows from there's Chaco Canyon, from lots of these different sites. I think in Newark, one of the things that struck me was in the center of the circle effigy mound, not the octagon, but the circle. There's what I think they call the Longhouse or the Eagle House.
Mm-hmm.
That apparently was a structure that would have hidden from view what happened sort of within the wings of the structure. And another example, one of the other sites is in New Hampshire called America's Stonehenge. I think that's a colloquial name given to it, but if you Google America's Stonehenge, you'll find it. Is another one of these sort of, there are several large stones involved in building the thing. It has the same astrological alignments with the sun at the solstice and all of that. It's also, I can't remember exactly, but there's a line that can be drawn across 2 points of the octagon at Newark, that intersects with the America's Stonehenge site, I believe. But at that site, there's a big like stone table, and the geography of the site is such that we would have a very difficult time, even with earth moving equipment, putting this stuff in there today. But the stone table is about the right size for a human and is ringed about the outside with like a groove that then drains off one corner to another sort of bowl rock. So there's a limited number of things that could be for.
Oh boy.
None of which are super pleasant to contemplate. Yeah, and then there was what we believe was a stone serpent effigy mound that Richie and Josh and all the guys that were kind of in the orbit
the
of
West
Sword
Virginia
Staff.
Serpent Mound.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
We took a hike up there one time and ended up standing on the back of, before we knew it, standing on the back of what I think was a serpent effigy mound created out of stone. It has, sort of a big head stone, and then sort of up above above the serpent head, a little bit up the ridge, there was similar, like a stone with a depression carved out of it, and there was another sort of, I mean, standing there and looking at it, I thought it's an offering to the snakehead, a little thing in front of the snakehead that was like a bowl stone. So I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, or I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know what I'm looking at, but based on being in that mind set from knowing these other things, like the table at America's Stonehenge, I think is pretty uncontroversially a sacrificial site. That's what it occurred. That's what it looked like to me. So yeah, I think that's another one of the like cultural markers that follows across these sites with this, with the cultist that follows this people group. Is these sites and tales of human sacrifice and human consumption.
Yeah, you can't escape it. Anywhere you look at this, even at like the most slant take on folklore, that's going to be part of the narrative. Um, and we can go back to like biblical depictions of the Rephaim and the Shadim, the spirits of the dead, who talks about your bed is a mat of worms. It was like this deep death netherworld literature, as well as like Enoch talking about these giants just straight up drank the blood of their enemies and each other. And we see that again. You talked about the pictographs, that imagery is there too, like kind of spiritualized large figures holding the heads of smaller people. I don't know that there's a rosy way to interpret that imagery, right? It's probably untoward. Would you say though, Ward, while you were on the Serpent Mound in West Virginia, were you standing on the shoulders of giants?
I don't know. I wouldn't. It didn't strike me as a place where you could bury anything. It would be really difficult to do. I mean,
Yeah.
you'd have to.
I mean, a lot of those, there's such rocky outcrops, like it's just stone with a
Yeah.
little dirt and a few trees on top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things on our our trip to Connecticut that I took with Joel Thomas,
Mhm.
hunting for melonheads, that we noted that was also present in Kirtland, Ohio.
Yep.
Were these low stone walls that
Mhm.
ran through the forest in seemingly inscrutable patterns. And I had assumed, oh, these are, things that maybe there was a colonial home here at some point and they built this. But we looked into it after the fact, and that's not the situation at all. No one
That
really
is
knows what.
Curious.
Yeah, and they're pretty deliberately stacked stone walls, maybe 3 to 4 feet in height, that run through just at seemingly at random.
I mean, there's a lot of inexplicable stonework in Ohio, in the rest of America. I think out in Montana, there's like a huge wall that has like it's like 100 miles from anything populated.
Yeah.
Just exists out there. Like,
Yeah, it's hilarious that
what was that?
Yeah, it's hilarious to think about the us just walking over these, like just stepping over it, like, oh, some colonial must have just put this here for no reason. Meanwhile, thousands of years ago, some hunter-gatherer culture is taking time away from, surviving to carry stone and line it up and very reverently, and we're just like, oh.
Yep. Or the giants who are mining copper out of Michigan. We're like, let's mark the ley line here, so we can summon our brothers from the sky when Pisces rises. Or like, whatever the heck is going on there.
Completely meaningless to us.
Right. We're so far removed, it just seems like inexplicable.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there will always be an element of that inexplicability. Like, we're just not ever going to figure it all out. But a conversation like this is helpful for me because I do think we have a lot of touch points between religion, archaeology, astronomy, all these different disciplines. What parts of myth are real? What parts of myth are merely symbolic? Where do we interact with the two? What does that mean for the average person? What happens when you actually, dig up a 8-foot skeleton in your backyard?
Yeah,
these are fascinating questions, and I think that's why it is worth still covering it in our own topic of trying to navigate the kind of mytho-historical biblical idea, because we live in a place where we take for granted that it's a totally mundane, benign place, and I think, frankly, the history of this continent is not benign and mundane.
I think one of the things as I get older and contemplate mortality more. My dad passing last year, and just so as you get older, you think, but nothing so accurately personifies death as sort of the open maw of a beast, like the open mouth of a dragon. And everybody's going in. And so psychologically, the idea of, one thing that's common to man, if you were to reduce, and I don't think this is like the truth behind the myth or anything like that, but if you were to reduce myth to like the psychological component of it, the thing that eats you
and, eats, for most of history, most of your children. Whether that's personified or not is, death is there, the giant mouth waiting to consume all.
Mm.
And I think not only does Christ's victory in lots of ways, that in lots of the interesting particularity kind of ways, like
Mhm.
he goes north to Mount Hermon, walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and all the, like, I think you've talked about before. Not only in that sense are there all these particulars of Christ vanquishing the giants in the giant rebellion,
Mhm.
um, but insofar as they hold an archetypal place of kind of death eating you, um, Christ walks back out of the throat of the dragon and just crushes it.
Yep.
So that for us, this is just like fun. Like there's an element of like we can look at it without the sheer terror that
Sure.
must have. Right.
We can see the eschatological end
Yeah.
already. That is, we know it gets wrapped up. But also, I think the challenge there is not to invalidate the difficulty and the real history of like what happens until we get to that point.
Yeah.
It's the already not yet paradox that we know it's vanquished, but we're still living with the effects of it. And I mean, we've talked in previous times together that those effects are at large in culture and in worldview and in society. So they're not to be laughed at, but we do know who has the last laugh.
Mm.
So there is that. That's the last thing I would say is we mentioned her many moons ago, and we had said that we weren't going to talk more about her, but I do think it's important to at least mention, like when we think about, okay, we have this kind of Hopewell integration theory where that's probably where most of these American giants kind of genetically hybridized themselves out of existence. They were either killed or they were married off so much that it was diluted. But think of the area where they were. It's Appalachia, right? The Ohio Valley. And that is where we have the very focused worship of Kokumthina as the goddess who's kind of brought in and sets up shop. I wonder, and this is just mere speculation as we close out today, but I wonder if, was she an import with this people group? Right? Like, we could meme all day of her like flying across the Atlantic away from the Middle East and setting up shop in West Virginia. Or is that a direct result of the fact that this giant population, these post-Amorites, these very bad news people show up and they import with them the veneration of this pagan principality and say, boom, plant the flag here on the Ohio River?
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, since the beginning of having any contact with this stuff, I've thought there's so much deception that it could be any number of.
Sure.
It could be entities aping an archetype of their progenitor entity.
It's true. There's a certain point where it's like, it's just kind of like ridiculous charade.
Yeah.
But in the end, we know, as you said, it comes to a close. And as much mystery as there is in the Americas to this day, even in our mundane post-capitalist Western society living here in Ohio, there's a way out, and it's the gospel truth of Jesus Christ. Amen and amen.
The Ohio Howl is a production of Dark Holler Studios and a labor of love. If you want to support the show, you can do 3 things. 1. Give us a review on your favorite podcatching app for a shout-out on the show. 2. Join the grand reenchantment conversation on the Sword and Staff Discord, link in description. And then 3. Buy something cool for your mom from the merch store over at www.darkhollerstudios.com. Until next time, his faithfulness is a shield and buckler. We shall not fear the terror of the night.